Hey guys, if you're watching this, welcome. You're going to review with me for the test. I'm just going to go through the study guide with you item by item and kind of tell you what you need to know for each of these things. The first one is the significance of Plessy versus Ferguson. You guys remember that was the case that had established the doctrine of separate but equal, and that created Jim Crow in the South and separate, public facilities and schools and things like that. So, of course, the famous case of Brown versus the Board of Education under the Warren Court um, actually reverses Plessy versus Ferguson. So Brown versus the board was the case that causes schools to desegregate. Okay. Rosa Parks, of course, was famous for refusing to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery and starting that Montgomery bus boycott. So she becomes like an icon of the civil rights movement. The Nation of Islam was different than the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in their methods, right? The SCLC was MLK's organization, and they pushed for peaceful protest, whereas the Nation of Islam wanted civil rights basically by any means necessary, as they said, including and up to violence if necessary. So that's a huge difference in philosophy. Eisenhower, of course, sent in federal troops to integrate Little Rock High School, and that was where the Little Rock Nine had tried to attend class, and they had basically been blocked by the governor and the National Guard. So Eisenhower decides to flex the federal muscle there and send in the 101st Airborne to integrate the school. Let's see. So the southern city that saw violence and a violent police reaction to protest was Birmingham, and that is where the international media kind of swoops in and gets all that on video, and it really convinces a lot of people of the rightness of the cause of the protesters. The main protest method, of course, favored by MLK and his organization was peaceful protest. And the difference between de jure and de facto segregation is that de jure segregation is segregation by law, and that's easier to change because you can change the law. De facto segregation is just segregation by practice, so that's a little harder to change. Like things like segregated neighborhoods, right? That aren't necessarily by law, but just it's kind of like quote unquote the way things are. The purpose of the Great Society was to address inequalities and poverty, and to try to pull people up from those situations where they were living in poverty. Also to increase educational opportunities, especially for poor people, and that's LBJ's program. The basic programs included VISTA, Volunteer and Serves to America, which is sort of like a domestic Peace Corps. They also had Job Corps, which is an organization that provides vocational training to low-income Americans. Remember HUD, Housing and Urban Development, was created. Medicare and Medicaid are some other sort of big things, as well as the Head Start program that we talked about. Lee Harvey Oswald was most likely the killer of JFK. And of course, when JFK dies, he's replaced by Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson will also be reelected in 1964. JFK's new frontier challenge regarding space was to get to the moon. Of course, he didn't live to see that happen, but that was accomplished. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was important for two reasons. One, it eliminated the poll tax, or I'm sorry, that's not right. It eliminated the literacy test, but it also put oversight of elections into federal hands, so they could begin observing elections in the South to make sure that they were fair and legal. The Peace Corps of JFK was designed to promote goodwill overseas and to help developing countries through American volunteers. MLK's civil disobedience was based on Thoreau's idea that it's a moral obligation to disobey a law that we feel is, immoral or even illegal. He tried it with not paying his taxes during the Civil War. MLK and his organization will do things like practice sit-ins, and so even though they're technically trespassing, they don't feel that they are, and so that's a big tactic of the movement. The Black Panthers are the militant civil rights organization from Oakland, and they're led by Huey Newton and Stokely Carmichael. MLK first gained notoriety in the civil rights movement when he led that Montgomery bus boycott that was started by Rosa Parks. Medicare is low-cost medical care for the elderly. Medicaid is medical care for people that are living below the poverty line. The Warren Commission, led by Earl Warren, investigated the assassination of John F. Kennedy and said that it was the work of a single assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Later, that finding was disputed by the House Committee on Assassinations. Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, which was a sort of landmark book in the environmental movement, and it brought attention to the use of DDT and chemicals in the environment, especially on crops. Ralph Nader was an advocate who fought for consumer rights against the automotive industry, and particularly for automotive safety. His book Unsafe at Any Speed captured a lot of attention and caused changes in Detroit. Miranda case was that the police have to read you your rights. Mount versus Ohio was the case that stated that evidence gained illegally, which was like obtained without a warrant, could not be submitted in court. And Gideon versus Wainwright was the case that said, that everyone has the right to a lawyer, even if they can't afford one. So that's where you get like public defenders coming in. The date of the March on Washington was significant in that it was the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. The 24th Amendment eliminated the poll tax forever. Malcolm X was the controversial spokesman for the Nation of Islam, a radical black organization. He was ultimately assassinated when he broke with the organization. The purpose of the Apollo program was to get to the moon, and that succeeded in 1969. And the first American or first man to step foot on the moon was Neil Armstrong. At the Greensboro Woolworths lunch counter in 1960, the sit-in movement began when members of the organization SNCC sat at the counter and refused to leave. This gained a lot of attention and started the sit-in movement nationwide. The Freedom Riders were a group of people who rode on integrated buses across the South to test the federal government's law desegregating public transportation. Of course, they were met with violence, as were the people who participated in Freedom Summer. That was a movement to register black voters in the South and especially in Mississippi. Hippies were young people who dropped out of society in the late 1960s. Drug use was a prevalent feature of this, as well as protests for the Vietnam War. And they created what would be called like a counterculture as opposed to the regular culture. The Feminine Mystique was a book by a lady named Betty Friedan, and the idea of the book is that women can be basically anything and not be relegated to like domestic duties like being a housewife. And of course, this is one of the catalysts and sparks for the women's movement. Roe versus Wade was the court case that made abortion legal in the United States. Now it's called the National Organization for Women, and that's the acronym for it. And again, this is an organization that fights for birth control rights and equality in the workplace for women. The Warren Court overall gave more rights to defendants in court cases, including the cases that we mentioned here. World War II can be seen as a catalyst for the civil rights movement in that it proved that African Americans were essentially worthy of equality to a lot of people who maybe thought otherwise before, probably because they served so bravely in combat as well as so admirably in factory jobs in the United States. And the significance of Woodstock is that it was the pinnacle of the hippie movement, and it proved sort of the idea that peace and love could work. Unfortunately, that movement for the hippies was short-lived. So I hope that helps. If you watched all of this, please be sure to comment your name in the Google form below this video. If you comment your name, I'll give you an additional 3 points on the test besides the study guide. Just don't tell anybody. Let them watch it for themselves, right? So comment your name in the form below the video, and I'll give you an extra 3 points on the test. Hope this helps. Thanks, guys. Have a great weekend, and I will see you on time on Monday.